All right, Alexander, let's do another update as to what's going on in Ukraine. Terrible day in Pavlivka, the fight there in Pavlivka for both sides, because I saw the UK Defense Ministry, the report that they put out, and the Institute for the Study of War, and they made it seem like it was only the Russians that suffered heavy losses. The Russians, from what I understand from the reports that I've gotten, the Russians did indeed suffer heavy losses, as did the Ukrainians. It was just a very bad day for both militaries. They suffered devastating losses in the fight for Pavlivka. We have a lot of activity from Jake Sullivan, a whole lot of activity, including the Wall Street Journal reporting that he has some sort of back channel diplomacy, or he had some sort of back channel diplomacy with Patrushev of the Kremlin, and they're talking about de-escalating if you, or at least not escalating further if you actually buy into that. I personally don't. And what else? You have the fear of a refugee crisis that is becoming very real now. And you have a lot of talk as well about a possible US, Polish, Romanian kind of mini NATO incursion into Ukraine as well, into the west of Ukraine. And I think that may be connected to Sullivan's activity as well. I think there's something going on in there. And then, of course, you have the renewed talk about the Kherson offensive, which may also be connected to Sullivan and his recent trip to Kiev as well. So a lot of activity going on. And it looks like Jake Sullivan is kind of sitting in the center of a lot of this stuff. Anyway, where do you want to begin? You want to begin
Well,
with
I think
Pavlivka, Ugledar, Kherson,
yeah,
the diplomacy stuff? Where should we start?
I think we do need to talk about Ugledar and Pavlivka first, because of course we must never forget that this is a war, and people are dying. And I mean, this has been a horror story. I mean, the story of Pavlivka. This is a village just next to Ugledar, which is this small town, very small town. It's about 11,000 people, I understand, before the war. But anyway, small town which sits astride communication routes between Zaporozhye and Donbass, and it's important. And the village of Pavlivka is seen as the gateway into the town, and the Russians have been trying to take it. And they launched an offensive against it about a week ago, and it's now come ground to a stop in the mud, and the artillery shelling, and the Ukrainians have moved troops in, and it's a battle that goes one way one moment, the other way the next. They've been fighting over this village, and British people who remember the First World War, the reports I'm getting about this battle suggest almost First World War type fighting. It's places like Passchendaele, which is a town that was fought over by the British and the Germans during the First World War. Ypres, some people call it. It has this sort of horror. It's intense shelling, people dying under intense shelling from each side, people being caught in the mud, and the Russians trying to advance, the Ukrainians trying to counterattack. What I will say about it is this. This was an attack which the Russians launched. The Russians chose this moment to attack in Pavlivka. It was they who launched this offensive about a week ago. And there's a lot of recriminations on the Russian side, I'm sure you've seen them, in which people are saying, why was this done? Why did we launch this attack now, in the middle of autumn, when the muds were so bad, before our reinforcements have arrived? The 300,000 men have arrived in large numbers so that we could sweep away Ukrainian resistance in a place like that. And I think those are valid criticisms, and they do point to some major problem within the Russian command. And I suspect that what has happened is that some Russian commander somewhere decided that he wanted to either impress the new overall Russian commander, General Surovikin, or perhaps was trying to steal a march on him, given that Surovikin appears to be replacing a lot of officers with his own people. So whatever it was, this has been a horrible battle, and of course it's continuing. And I suspect that before long, the Russians will call off this attack because it's clearly not succeeding, and certainly the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy losses, probably more actually than the Russians have done. But if the Russians can't capture Ugledar, and it doesn't seem as if they will, then I have to say that this isn't good for the Russians. I would even say that it was a defeat for them. So, I mean, I wanted to say that about Pavlivka because I think, we've got to be straightforward about these things. A misconceived attack which hasn't gone well. Now, having said that, if we're looking at the overall military picture in Ukraine, Pavlivka is a detail. The big event is the fact that the Russians are now gradually, steadily, remorselessly building up their forces. These 300,000 men are gradually being inducted into the military there. There's also more and more evidence that the Russians are pouring equipment into the front lines and that they're apparently building up their drone forces as well. So the overall balance, whatever happens in Pavlivka is swinging to the Russian side. And this brings us to the big news, which is Jake Sullivan, because suddenly we see this flurry of activity by Jake Sullivan, and it all contradicts itself. It's overcomplicated. On the one hand, he's supposed to be talking to Patrushev about de-escalation. At the same time, he's supposed to be we're having all these reports now in the American media, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Guardian in Britain, that the Americans, which in this context almost certainly means Sullivan, are urging the Ukrainians to start negotiations, or at least to be open to negotiations with the Russians. And there's all sorts of complicated explanations being provided for that. And at the same time, we're also getting reports that Sullivan is urging Ukraine to relaunch this offensive in Kherson region. I think what's happened is that people in the United States are getting increasingly worried about the way this is going, about the Russian build-up. They're getting worried about the economic situation in Europe, the economic situation ultimately in the United States. They're worried about the fact that the Democrats look like they're going to lose badly in the midterms. So they've sent Jake Sullivan to try to patch something up. They want some kind of exit strategy from this conflict, but at the same time, they want to end it on a high note with a victory. So that's why he's been sent to Kherson region to try to get to Kiev to try to get this offensive in Kherson region restarted. They need that victory. And of course, far from de-escalating, the very fact that they're talking about an offensive at this time means that what they're really going to do, I think, is escalate or try to escalate, because they need that win in order to be able to pretend that they've achieved what they set out to achieve in Ukraine, that this has all been some victory, so that they can declare victory and try to find some way to pull back. That's my assessment of what Sullivan is up to. I'm going to say straight away, I don't think everybody in Washington is signed up to this. I think there's the hardliners who want to go on until they achieve regime change in Moscow, and we've even heard stories that they've even set up an alternative government for Russia somewhere. And at the same time, there's going to be other people in Washington with entirely different agendas that we don't even know about. But I think Sullivan is really ultimately the big story, even though Pavlivka is this horror that's happened on the ground.
Do you think that the Russians are going to give up completely on the Pavlivka Ugledar direction? Because that would mean they give up on Donetsk. So that doesn't, I mean, that would go against the entire foundation of the SMO.
No. They're not going to give up on the Pavlivka Ugledar thing. What I'm going to say is I think they're going to call off this particular attack now. I think it was ill-timed. I think that what they're going to do is that they're going to wait until they get reinforcements and until the ground has hardened. And by the way, the skies have cleared a bit because, autumn is a time of heavy rains and all that. So it's more difficult to operate drones, helicopters, aircraft, and that sort of thing. So I think that they want to try to dial down the battle at the moment so that they can resume it with much greater force in, say, 2 weeks' time.
A slow grind.
A slow grind, which is, by the way, what the overall Russian commander, General Surovikin, said that he wanted. He didn't want, as he said, big arrow offensives. He wanted to grind the Ukrainians down. He said that in an interview he gave 3 weeks ago on Russian television.
Right. Okay, so let's return to Sullivan. You're saying that, well, one possibility is that Sullivan is looking to get this Kherson win. Let's call it that, a Kherson city win from Ukraine. And then if you can get that win, perhaps that will be the PR media off-ramp for the U.S. to exit this conflict. So then they'll be able then to negotiate with Putin, or perhaps they're thinking they can then sit down with the Kremlin and say, look, you've lost Kherson, you're losing this war, let's come to a deal. And the Biden White House can chalk up a victory. Perhaps they may be thinking that they may not get regime change in the Kremlin, but at least Putin can... I don't even know how he would spin it, to be quite honest. No. I think the Russian public would be furious. But anyway, maybe that's not. Maybe Sullivan hasn't even considered that. I don't know. But the whole thing just seems a little flawed. Is that what you're saying, or
it's not a little flawed? It's completely flawed. Let's just unpack this. Firstly, let's say that there is this Kherson offensive, and let's say that it succeeds in capturing Kherson city. Let's put aside what the Russians think about this. What would happen in that kind of situation? Is it really plausible that the Ukrainians and their hardline allies in Washington would say, right, we've got Kherson back. Let's stop everything. Let's now sit down with Putin and come to some kind of a deal with him and accept that he keeps, Donbass and Crimea and all the rest and de-escalates in some way. I mean, that's not going to happen. If these people are able to capture Kherson, they'll say, well, we're winning, so let's go on fighting. Let's go on and keep advancing, because that's what the neocons do. So it's not going to work on the American side of the picture. The second is, and I think that some Americans don't understand this because they're very tied up with this idea of Putin as this overall dictator in Russia. I think that, again, if the Russians lose Kherson, Putin is under a constitutional duty in that case to take it back, because it's now Russian territory. And the Russian constitution prevents him ceding Russian territory to a third party. And of course, on top of that, you're absolutely correct. If the Russians are driven out of Kherson, there will be a massive political reaction in Moscow. Russian public opinion will demand that it be taken back. And if Putin then sits down at the negotiating table, he's going to find that he's going to come in for more criticism than he has done at any time since he became president. In fact, the criticism would be overwhelming in that case.
He would be gone. He would be gone.
It would be a political crisis.
I think he would be gone. Yeah.
I can't imagine him doing it. I can't imagine him agreeing to something like that. So I think, remember, we've said lots about Sullivan and how completely out of his depth he is, how completely unrealistic he is. I think this is Sullivan's strategy because it's the only thing that explains these contradictory signals that he's giving out. But it can't work. It won't work on the American side because the neocons won't accept it. They'll say, we've got Kherson, so let's go on and march and take Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea as well. And it won't work on the Russian side because Putin can never agree to a deal on that basis either. So Sullivan may be thinking that this provides him and his boss, Biden, with some kind of off-ramp, but actually it doesn't. It just creates confusion and it intensifies the war.
Yeah, I think it would be an option. I don't even think it is an option for
No,
the Putin
no.
administration to cede Kherson at this moment in time because, as you said, it is Russian territory. It would be a move that is impossible for that
No.
government to make. So I was thinking that
Putin has.
perhaps this
Can I
back.
just say Can I just say something?
Yeah,
Because Putin has, of course, specifically ruled that out. He has said that he's prepared to sit down and negotiate with Ukraine about anything, but not about the status of the four
not
regions.
yeah.
So, I mean,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's impossible. I was thinking that this back channel diplomacy between Sullivan and Patrushev that the Wall Street Journal was talking about, that perhaps Sullivan, instead of talking about de-escalating, or at least not escalating further, which is what the Wall Street Journal says they're discussing. I was thinking, my mind went to Sullivan perhaps issuing warnings
mm,
to the Russians that if you guys dial things up like we see you're dialing things up, well then we've got all of these NATO, U.S., Polish, Romanian troops who might get involved. I mean, do you think something like that could be a play?
absolutely. And bear in mind, American troops are now on the ground in Ukraine. We've had movements of American nuclear submarines into the Mediterranean with ballistic missiles. It seems to me much more likely that, on the one hand, Sullivan is trying to say to Patrushev, got to sit down and talk because, we've got all this power behind us. We're winning in Kherson. We've got all this might. We've got all these troops ready to intervene. It seems to me that far more likely what he's trying to do is he's got to walk away, at least from his point of view, he's got to walk away with something that he can package as a victory. So what he's trying to do, I think, is not get the Russians to agree to a mutual de-escalation. He's trying to pressure the Russians and the Ukrainians simultaneously into sitting down and talking. But of course the Russians won't and the Ukrainians won't. Not on the terms that Sullivan says. But bear in mind the point we've made about Sullivan many times in many programs. He is inexperienced and very overconfident. He's one of these people who, as I said, thinks he's a genius when he's not. And I can very easily see how he can imagine, if I really, threaten the Russians with Polish, Romanian, American troops on the ground, with nuclear submarines in the Mediterranean, with all those sort of things, then, the Russians will say, oh my gosh, we're losing in Kherson region. We might lose in Kherson region. Of course, they haven't lost in Kherson region yet, and they might never do. But Sullivan might be thinking that, the Russians might be worried about these things and might come round to doing what he wants without understanding the actual political dynamics in Moscow, which make that impossible. By the way, that wouldn't be the first time. If you go back to Vietnam, the Vietnam War, the United States at that time and the people who surrounded Lyndon Johnson, some of them were not very different from Jake Sullivan. They initially, when the Johnson administration decided the talks with North Vietnam had to begin, they tried the same twin track policy as did the Nixon administration, which is that they intensified bombing at the same time as they offered talks. In other words, they escalated and at the same time offered talks. And they were astonished to find that it didn't work. And they will find the same thing again this time because they don't understand the motivations the politics that drives the other side. I think one point that perhaps Americans don't understand is that Putin isn't under any pressure to sit down and talk in Russia. The economy is stable, the military is reinforcing. He probably doesn't feel under any pressure to make any sort of concessions. He would feel under an awful lot more pressure if he did make concessions. So it's difficult to see what the attraction to Putin would be if he went along with the kind of things that Sullivan is talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, if Sullivan really wanted to get to the negotiating table, all he would have to do is to tell Zelensky to just sit down and negotiate. Zelensky has to do it because Zelensky doesn't call the shots. At the end of the day, it is Sullivan and the neocons and the United States that calls the shots for Ukraine. So if he really wanted some sort of peace or some sort of a negotiation, he doesn't even need to even deal with the Russian side. First, he has to just tell Zelensky, look, sit down at the table with Russia. Offer it.
That's exactly what he can.
And of course, they can't do that. Not in this current state.
No, that's exactly what he should do if he wanted peace. He doesn't want peace. What he wants is something that he can sell to the American people and the world, and indeed the Russian people too, as a victory. Why would the Russians give him a victory?
Let's shift focus to a potential refugee crisis. And I'm starting to see a lot of publications, especially in the UK, talking about catastrophe in Ukraine, a refugee catastrophe in Ukraine, because of the situation with electricity, water supply, sewage, communication, all of these things. And we had the story from the New York Times where they reported that they have a plan to evacuate the 3 million residents of Kiev. Then they denied the officials then said, no, that's not a plan. And then they said, yes, it is a plan. So, I mean, they've gone back and forth on this New York Times story, but it's out there now.
Absolutely.
The New York Times somehow dug up that there are people in Kiev that are thinking about a mass evacuation. And if they're thinking about it in Kiev, then you know that they're thinking about it in Odessa and Lviv and all kinds of other places. And you know, my mind always goes to, where are these people going to be evacuated to?
Yeah.
They're either going to have to go to Russia, or they're going to have to go west to Europe. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, Russia is definitely going to knock out, at least that's how I see it, they're definitely going to knock out Ukraine's electric grid. That's what they're going for, it seems.
Yes.
This is a huge problem for Europe and for the UK. The Daily Mail, if you want to put your trust in the Daily Mail, but they said they could be looking at 800,000 refugees trying to get into the UK. And I've heard numbers around 6 to 8 million trying to get into Europe. I mean, this dwarfs Turkey, Syria, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you remember, it was 1 million refugees, I think, that came into Europe during the 2015 crisis. And we'll be looking at 6 to 8 million on this crisis. And can I just say, if they do evacuate the cities, Kiev and the rest, there's only one place they can go, which is Europe. I mean, many of them perhaps would want to go to Belarus and Russia, but I mean, the Ukrainian authorities aren't going to want to evacuate them to Russia. I mean, that isn't where they want them to go. They're going to steer them towards Europe, because that's the only place that they can come to. Now, you know, we both live in Europe. We follow European politics, British politics, incredibly closely. We know the enormous effect that earlier immigration flows have had in forming European politics. We know, for example, I mean, I am very well aware, for example, of the important role that immigration from Eastern Europe had in hardening opinion in working class British communities in support of Brexit. Just one example. The effect of 6 to 8 million Ukrainian refugees pouring into Europe just doesn't even bear thinking about. Meloni in Italy has just won an election largely on an anti-immigration platform. So have the Democrats in Sweden, the Swedish Democrats. I mean, if 6 to 8 million people start moving westward towards Europe, well, the effect on European politics is going to be dramatic. Now, what are European leaders doing about this? Are they sitting down? Are they urgently talking with Zelensky to discuss this? Are they anxiously phoning up Kiev to find out what's going on? Are they preparing contingency plans? No, they're doing nothing. They're sitting there waiting for this army of Ukrainians to come in their direction. And remember, they've been opening the doors to Ukrainians. There's already people who've gone to Poland, and we know that in Poland already there's tensions between Poles and Ukrainians who've come into Poland. The same is true in Germany. This is going to create a crisis that's going to make 2015 look minor by comparison. And I would not be surprised if this is what finally blows the European Union up. Remember, these people will be coming into Europe at the same time that Europe is going to be falling into an extremely deep recession, and when there might very well be energy blackouts across Europe because Europe is running out of gas and heating, and with factories all over Europe closing down. Where do all of these people get housed, for example? Who's going to house them? Where are they going to stay? What kind of funds are going to be provided to sustain them? Are they going to be given jobs? If so, how is that going to happen in a time of recession? Where and at whose expense?
How?
And how? But again, it's a classic example of how ideology has blinded European leaders to the reality to the consequences of what they're doing.
All right, so just to end the video on this refugee issue, what could be a refugee issue, Russia knows this.
No.
Ukraine knows this.
Yeah.
This is, I think, what makes this different than Turkey, the Turkey-Syria 2015 refugee crisis. Yeah. The thing that makes it different is that in the case of Ukraine, I am getting reports that the Zelensky government is going to Europe and they're saying, you know what, we need €1 billion a month. We need equipment, we need blankets, heaters, we need you to fix our electric grid, we need all these things. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at 6 to 8 million refugees. That's what they're telling Europe, which kind of follows what Turkey and Erdogan were telling Europe, and it worked. Europe paid Turkey, and Turkey said, okay, we'll hold these refugees. So you could see some parallels there.
Yes.
And that what Zelensky's trying to do and what Erdogan did, to a certain extent, there's some parallels.
Yes.
Will Europe pay Zelensky $1 billion a month? Sure, they might say, yeah, well, if you can manage to hold these refugees in country, we'll pay you that $1 billion and we'll do whatever we can. Yes. I even think Macron said something along those lines, that France is going to do everything they can to make sure that there's not an energy crisis, an electricity crisis in Ukraine, not France. In Ukraine was what he was worried about. The difference in all of this is that Turkey didn't have a Russia sending drones and missiles every other day, dismantling their economy.
Yes.
That's the difference in all of this. And my thinking, on a final note, I just keep on thinking to myself that Putin doesn't want to end this war with a military victory. He wants to end this war via economic means. That's what I'm thinking. I'm just thinking the Kremlin may be saying, we don't really need to march on to Kiev or Odessa.
No.
We're just going to crash the country, and Europe doesn't have the money to save it. The U.S. doesn't have the money to save it.
No. Well, that's perfectly true.
I don't know.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, but bear in mind that the two are not mutually exclusive. I mean, you might still want a military victory and an economic collapse and a massive economic pressure on Europe. I mean, in fact, I'm pretty sure that the Kremlin wants all of those and is working to achieving all of those. But the point is, you're absolutely correct. Erdogan, you could bribe Erdogan to stop the refugees, and he could. He was able to turn the refugees on and off as a tap, like a tap, because he was in full control of his own country. Zelensky's not in control of his country. As you correctly said, he's got drones flying in, missiles flying in. He can't intercept them. We've been hearing all these stories about how, the Ukrainians are shooting down drones and missiles, and it's clear that they're not. I mean, again, Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, so that they shot down 16 missiles out of the 16 missiles that were launched. They shot down 16, and then he went on to say, well, 4 targets were then destroyed. Destroyed by whom? They were all. You get all of this nonsense. So they're not able to parry this threat, and of course, providing blankets and stoves isn't going to make any difference. I mean, you can't substitute for a proper functioning electricity and energy system. I mean, that is impossible. And so you will be giving $1 billion a month, presumably, to Zelensky and his friends to keep the refugees in Ukraine, the people in Ukraine. But of course, they might not be able to deliver on that, in which case you're giving $1 billion a month to notoriously corrupt people in reliance upon a promise which may never be honored.
Yeah. All right. Anything else?
No, I think
wanna
we've
discuss,
covered
or
it. I mean,
anything else to add, or-
it's no, I did. I mean, the
Speaking on air
fascinating.
defense, there is news that the. No, I just want to say, I don't know if you want to comment. The news on the NASAMS have arrived,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you mentioned air
exactly.
defense. I don't know if you want to
Exactly.
say something
I mean,
about it. Yeah.
I'm not an expert on air defense systems, but every single authority I've looked at that is knowledgeable about these things says that these systems are far too few to make a difference, and that they are less effective than the air defense systems that Ukraine had at the start of the war, the S-300s. The Russian air defense systems that Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union, even though they're quite old, are actually more potent. They've got more powerful capabilities than these do. And besides, with the Russians now, apparently some reports say that they're cranking up to launching 100 drones a day at Ukraine. Well, Ukraine isn't going to have 100 missiles to launch against each one of these little drones. It's simply impossible. Any air defense system that Ukraine is supplied by the West, which will be in limited numbers and with little capability, is going to be overwhelmed by this thing.
Right. Okay. We will leave it there, the Duran.locals.com, and we are on Rockfin as well. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.